Thank you very much for that. And to all my new friends at DMI for the excuse to come back to Madison. I'm not sure if I have to do something for my PowerPoint to start up. Oh, there it is. And it was a pleasant invitation, excuse to come back. The only time I've been to Madison previous to this was in the 1990s, when I, in my 20s, was an eager young city planner, passionate about downtown revitalization, and I took a specific trip here to come to study State Street, which was, at the time, in my opinion, one of the rare, almost unique, successful pedestrianized streets in North America, something that at the time it was said wasn't possible to have a successful pedestrianized street. That certainly has changed in the last few decades. When I got the invitation to come back, one of the reasons I said yes is because I was very eager to see if my actual memory of State Street in any way resembled reality anymore. So my tour over the day today, and if you follow me on Twitter, the coordinates are there, I'm starting to provide some commentary on some of my observations here in Madison. But I'd say in many ways it lived up to my memory, which was extremely favorable, I might say. But in some ways was surprisingly different, which I think is less about change in your city and more about just the devolving nature of my memory. But I certainly, normally when I come into a city, I've had a chance to work with the city for at least a few days before I'm in front of an audience like you. So I've had more of an opportunity to absorb the city's DNA, its nature, et cetera, do what I call an urban diagnosis. So I've had only a limited opportunity to do that. But in my talk, I am going to be, in some cases, referencing some things I've specifically observed in my 24 hours here. To help make the point of some of the things I talk about from my global experiences. And as I was about to board a plane to come to Madison, one of the main questions I asked for myself at the time is, given the date that I'm arriving here in the United States, should I start with a joke about the presidential election? And so I did what you should always do when you're faced with a tough question. I asked Twitter. And Twitter, like your country, was divided on the issue. There was a solid response that said, absolutely not. It's too raw. There's nothing funny about this election. And people won't take it well. The other side said, Madison is the birthplace of the Onion, so has a very good sense of humor. And so absolutely you should make a joke. Something about Trudeau, our prime minister, and panda bears, I think it was. I can't exactly remember the reference. And somewhere in the middle came this comment that said, by all means, go ahead, but make sure it's funny. So on that note, I'm going to change the subject. And maybe I'll just replace my joke with this, which I saw on my tour today. I took a few pictures of Madison today. So on to the city planning then. So when I'm talking about, I've been asked to talk about trends. When I talk about the things that many cities across North America and increasingly as I work around the world are facing, the starting point is to say that there's more the same about what cities are facing than there is different. And we're all facing, certainly across the North American border, but all over the world, these same convergence of issues where there is a powerful and strong conversation about how better city building is at least a bedrock of the answer, whether your issues are housing affordability, unpredictable energy costs, climate change directly connected to how we build cities and suburbs, aging populations, and now the growth of the millennial generation in population size, public health continuously and strongly being tied to how we build cities and suburbs, and increasingly issues of sameness and placelessness and identity in terms of how we brand our cities and how we differentiate them, not just economically in terms of competition, but socially and from a quality of life perspective, so that we're not all bored of how our cities all feel increasingly the same in other places. The consequences of doing a better job in how we build our cities have never been more clear. And by the way, only when I come to America do I still hear the words, I believe in climate change, still being uttered. And I have to say, in my work around the world, belief and science aren't so easily interconnected as they are here in the United States. But what I say to my global audience is that even America, I think, has bridged that divide. And since Hurricane Sandy, certainly, I have found the conversation about climate change as it relates to city and region building is a very different conversation now. And maybe it was headlines like "It's global warming stupid" that has finally got to the point where we can have a conversation. Although one would think by some of the political discourse in this election that there's still a way to go on that. Nothing in my PowerPoint has been a result of any kind of a Chinese, yeah. Sometimes we look at our friends across the border and we just shake our head. All we can do is do that. If you're not motivated by climate change, the strongest asset, the strongest ally we have in the conversation about better city making and region making has been increasingly our public health care friends, our public health officials, who are actively and proactively connecting the dots between how we build things and the results on all sorts of different preventable epidemics of preventable disease, from diabetes to general issues of obesity to issues of diabetes, health, asthma, early onset diabetes, etc. And so we're connecting the dots, particularly in the suburbs, about how we build relates to rebuilding the idea of exercise or physical activity into our daily lives, or the opposite, as we did in so many decades of the suburbs, building exercise out of our daily lives. And this has been a powerful change. In Canada, this was manifested in a particular event that I noticed, where 4 Greater Toronto area public health care officials held a press conference, got a huge amount of media attention on the issue of walkable neighborhoods and public transit and bikeability in cities, and how we needed to invest significant and sustained funds in public transit, walking, and biking in order to prevent massive public health care costs. And these were public health care officials that got a huge amount of press. And I noticed at the time that if the 4 chief planners of those regions had held a press conference, maybe nobody would have come. But the public health care professionals got a huge amount of media attention, and thus stimulated a huge amount of public conversation about this. And I noticed again with my clients in Australia, I was hired to go down to Australia and work with multiple state and local governments on issues of smarter, healthier city making and region making. And it wasn't the states or the local governments that hired me, it was the Heart Foundation of Australia who brought me down to work with these other levels of governments, because they had connected the dots. They created this great document, which you can find online. Does density matter? The role of density in creating walkable neighborhoods and thus preventing preventable diseases through walking, biking, and public transit. And if you don't want to read the document, I'll give away the ending. Density does matter. If you do density smartly, and that's a lot of what I talk about. But this is a powerful game changer in the narrative around why we need to build our cities and suburbs differently. And if you're not motivated by that, if you're just a dollars and cents kind of person, Canada actually is one of the global leaders in doing much smarter math about the costs, fiscal costs, particularly to municipalities in the public sector, but also to the private sector, on how we grow. And we've had study after study in Canadian cities in the last 10 years. A city I used to plan for, Calgary, was one of the first, that looks at if you grew in this direction or that direction, and if you grew up versus out, the consequences over the life of a plan, say 20 years or so, $3 billion, $15 billion. What I say is, when you start to see headlines like this in the newspapers, it makes it very hard to not know this. Whether you're a so-called fiscal conservative politician or a progressive politician, this matters to you. Billions of dollars matters to you. And we've observed in the United States cities that are ahead of us in this kind of costs and consequences that are virtually going bankrupt because of the cost. So whether it's climate change, whether it's public health epidemics that are preventable and related to how we build, or whether it's just fiscal sustainability, the dollars and cents of things, the new math is changing the political discourse. And I like to say that my favorite is the money these days, because it breaks down this right-wing or left-wing political discourse. It's not whether you're right or left, it's whether you're smart or dumb. And it fundamentally has changed the political discourse in most parts of the world, and I'm waiting to see how much it resonates here in the United States. So I say cities and suburbs are changing, not because of ideology, but because of better math. And once we have better math, smarter math, and can combine it with better storytelling, we start to change people's minds, politicians' minds, the media's minds, the public's minds. We also have the benefit that the demographics are on our side. The largest demographic group on planet Earth, the second largest in human history, the millennials, are predisposed towards looking for places, as you've seen in your own context in recent years, predisposed to places that are walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly, etc., that provide an urban condition. And you have new employers that have drawn this kind of millennial energy to your own city that I've heard about today. This is a game changer. This is a group that has, in large numbers, put off or even avoided entirely the getting of their driver's licenses, that treat the smartphone as the key to freedom in the way that previous generations treated the car. They have a fundamentally different attitude toward renting, a fundamentally different attitude towards mobility, and they can go anywhere. And they don't like to commit too long to a place. That's one of the reasons why they avoid a mortgage. So they can go anywhere and take their capital and their creativity and their energy with them. And you're one of the cities that currently has been benefiting from that. But the question is, in my mind, what happens when the millennial group, demographic group, gets old enough to be generating families, creating families, having kids, in other words? And I'll come back to that. In the meantime, their parents, the largest demographic group in human history, the boomers, have been increasingly predisposed to the kind of urban conditions that your downtown and inner city represents. And I hope you're not insulted by this term. It's not my term, it's the Wall Street Journal's. But this idea of the broken hipsters, the idea that the baby boomer group is acting like the hipsters are supposed to, in the sense that they want walkable communities, they want options that allow them to forego car use, if not car ownership. And in many cases, because this is the demographic group that has the money, they're out competing their own kids for real estate in the context of things. Maybe, hopefully, at least they're buying units for their own kids, at least to get them out of the basement if necessary. But these are the two largest demographic groups in human history predisposed towards more urban conditions and multimodal thinking in the case of walking, biking, and transit. So I like to say for cities, what's your excuse if you're not doing urbanism better? Because you've got a demographic tailwind. Back when I first started in planning, it seemed hard because all the baby boomers wanted were the suburbs. Now we've got an incredible demographic push, a tailwind, a shift that has benefited urban conditions, multimodal thinking, etc. And by the way, the demographic group in the middle, the age groups that are having children, what we in Vancouver have proved and other cities have proved is that if you build for families, if you design for families, you will attract kids, families, households with children in vast numbers that will even surprise you. In Vancouver, for example, that's a headline from Vancouver, 4 children, not unusual in the downtown setting. 7,000 children in our downtown peninsula in Vancouver in the past few decades. That's about 6,800 more than we had a few decades ago. By design, because the narrative is that, oh, families will never want to live downtown, and as soon as the double income household has children, they want to move to the suburbs. Not if you design for children. We've been designing urban places and downtowns, though, to virtually repel families, and thus created a self-fulfilling prophecy that downtowns can't attract kids. It starts with actual homes that can fit families, 2 and 3 bedroom or more sizes. It extends to things like daycare and schools and a public realm and parks that are designed first for kids so that they work well for everyone. This is important, and we have proved to American audiences, because we are North American, we're not that different from you, that if you design for families, you get this demographic group first, as well as the other 2 demographic groups. And now what we're finding is that the 2 groups that are going to duke it out for the millennials are the urban places that are going to have to plan and design for families, and the suburban places that are going to want to retrofit for walking, biking, and transit. It's those 2 development niches, if you will, bad term, they're not really niches, that are going to duke it out to attract the millennials. And I'd like to see both of them win, because then we get better urban places and better suburbs, which are the 2 things we need. In Vancouver's context, we get a lot of attention because we're doing a lot of our city making in ways that have worked. And in essence, we've been benefiting from generations of success. And I like to point out all the things that you start to get attention for. Once you're sort of on a roll, you're kind of a city that gets ranked and gets attention for things too. So you know what I mean. But the most interesting thing on this list is economically successful city. I like to bring this up in places where perhaps the state government might be more conservative, because this is a dollars and cents argument. This is about fundamentally economic success. Nothing I'm talking about is communist or socialist. I often point out that the land developers in Vancouver make more profit than just about any American land developers I've ever seen. And that includes a certain presidential candidate. Boy, that's 3 times now I've kind of hinted at that without saying the word. Having said that, so you've got demographic tailwinds, you've got a recognition that the consequences of inaction are huge. But yet, I always like to point out that regardless of this, at some point in my talk, most of you will be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language. We could never do that in our city. And I got a little bit of that in a friendly way at lunch today. Explanations of, don't you know, Brent, that here we have this, or that, or the other thing. And there's always, and it always sounds hard. It always sounds daunting. And I always point out that nothing that I'm talking about was intended to be easy. I don't put it out to you as, there are no quick fixes. Nothing I'm talking about is simple or easy. All of this is incredibly hard. But the cities that I'm working in that are doing it are showing these 3 things: vision, will, and skill. It's not about who has the best legal positioning, the best state government, the best current leadership, the best organizational structure of nonprofits. It's the ones that are getting past a culture of excuse into a culture of action, notwithstanding the things that are standing in their way. Vision, will, and skill. And I point out often that people think that Vancouver is an easy place to do work. Before I worked in Vancouver, I was a planner for an equal amount of time in Calgary, Canada, which is often called the most American of Canadian cities. Very conservative, and they mean the right-wing part of America when they say that, by the way. This is oil country in Canada. And it's interesting that that city, not just during the time I was there, but certainly since, has been doing some of the most innovative and interesting things around urban design, sustainability. They're coming at it, though, from the business case perspective. This is good business. This is private sector success stories, because they recognize that this is part of their, everything from their city branding to their economic success. So I often say that the most left-wing and the most right-wing cities in Canada, both of which I've worked for, are duking it out about who's going to be the smarter city maker. And they're coming at it for different reasons, but they're ending up in the same places. And then my clients in Medellin, Colombia, I just have to point this out, because if you have never been to Latin America and seen what Latin American cities are doing, we all in North America have to get out more. Because the things that are happening in other parts of the world, this is the bus rapid transit system, the LRT, the cable cars that have managed to get past issues of slope repurposing, technologies like cable cars from ski slopes and escalators from shopping malls or transit stations in order to make the city more multimodal at incredibly low costs, and retaking back their public spaces. This was the murder capital of the world 2 decades ago. This is Pablo Escobar and guerrilla warfare. This was a place that you literally were afraid to walk down any street. For good reason, far more than the perception issues we have in North America. This is a city that turned itself around in just 2 decades, and it's now called the Medellin Miracle. So I often point out that if you think your problems are tough, they are not as tough as this city's. And yet, the transformation that has happened, remarkable. And yet, when they asked me to come in and advise them, they were still struggling with the issue of how to be more pedestrian-focused. And ironically, they said to me at the time when I was talking to them about solutions, they said, but Brent, the car lobby is so powerful here. We have no idea how to overcome the incredible positioning and persuasiveness of the car lobby. And I said, you're kidding me, right? You're the city that took on Pablo Escobar, and you're afraid of the car lobby? And I said that in the media. It got a lot of attention and created an interesting conversation. But it shows that what's interesting to me is that I'm often being called in by the most successful cities in the world, and they all want to get much better. The more ambitious a city is, the more ambitious a city seems to be. There's something about that psychology. that I find really profoundly powerful. And yet, every city can find itself on this continuum of what I call the evolution towards smart planning. And when I work in American cities, I always think, I actually generated this after doing some work in Florida. You start off doing the wrong thing, and we've been in North America doing the wrong thing for several decades in many different areas. Then you put a lot of energy into doing the wrong thing better. And there's a lot of our North American cities, in Canada too, that are deeply entrenched in trying to do the wrong thing better. And I always point out that if you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it better. So I applaud that, but never mistake that for the right thing. You need to have a conversation about what the right thing looks like and how you get there from here. And then when I was working in Brisbane, Australia, I added in the try to have your cake and eat it too era, where you're building LRT and you're putting in bike infrastructure at the same time as widening your freeways, trying to think that you can try to do both of those things successfully, and of course you can't. And then finally doing the right thing. So on an issue-by-issue basis, think about your Madison in this context. Where is your city today? In Vancouver, we've gotten a lot of attention about the downtown that we built. And this is just one generation, 20 years, 1983 to 2003. How much transformation. Somebody said to me today they were in Vancouver 10 years ago, and I said, it's different now. Because this is how fast a hot city and a hot market can transform, particularly a young city like Vancouver on the West Coast. Just 20 years. I say that you can do a lot of good or a lot of damage in a relatively short period of time in a hot market, depending on the value system that guides and drives your city making. But it is the rest of Vancouver where the real challenges are. That's downtown way in the background. In the foreground, the rest of the city. Rectilinear, well-designed from a street layout perspective, well-served by transit, low-density development, but increasing and established neighborhoods. We all know that's the tough place to have the conversation about change, about densification, etc. And at the regional level, I know that regional transit is a key issue for you folks here. This is our regional level, 2.4 million at a regional level, bound by the water, the mountains, and the US-Canadian border, and increasingly restricted by, and additionally restricted by the agricultural land reserve, which our forefathers had the brilliance to do long before we used terms like food security, protect the most fertile agricultural land in Western Canada. So yes, we have many reasons to obviously have a conversation about densification, but yet, as we've seen in places like Portland, you can still do your growth poorly in the suburban context. How we've done it is through the creation of transit-supported, mixed-use, high-density town centers in the suburbs, suburban downtowns. We've done our downtown, our suburbs fundamentally different than the most of the North American contexts. By the way, I have to say, I was really pleased when Downtown Madison, Inc. asked me to come and not just talk about downtown, but rather talk about cities and even regions and suburbs, with the recognition that you can't just have a conversation about downtown, because downtown is not an island. This is the kind of thing you can achieve when you properly invest in and fund regional transit. I know this is a key issue for you folks. Our suburbs are as significant an achievement as our downtown is, because this is the kind of thing we've been building. Instead of this, and I always point out the success or failure of our city regions and ultimately our survival, even to a downtown audience, I say, depends on how well we do our suburbs. Because particularly over the last decade or so, we've been doing our inner city pretty well. But we can do our inner city almost perfectly and still fundamentally fail at a city regional level. Not all suburbia is sprawl. I don't use suburbia and sprawl interchangeably in terms of terms, but too much of it is, and if you want a very simple definition of sprawl, it's auto-dependency. I didn't get to see your suburbs very much today, but I asked a simple question, are your suburbs auto-dependent? And the answer I heard was yes. Not sure if anyone in the audience would disagree. So that means a lot of your suburbia is sprawl. Suburbs don't have to be auto-dependent. They can have choices. This is Vancouver's suburbs. This was a 25-year-ago Mark I first-generation transit-oriented development. High-density, mixed-use, amenity-rich, on SkyTrain transit, which is our light rail system, elevated light rail system. I often point out that would never get approved in Vancouver now, all sorts of things that we point out that show it's not good enough. And yet, American urbanists flock to Vancouver to check it out because it was built. And an awful lot, and many of you know if you work in transit-oriented development, there's been a lot of talk in North America and not a lot of building. So examples that are actually physically built are rare. These are some of the new things we've been doing lately, where the former 1960s suburban shopping mall, which you can see in the corner, the sea of parking, being transformed as we speak into vertical villages, vertical urbanism, sprouting towers on top of densified shopping and office space. Highly urban, highly public realm oriented. Another in one of our suburbs, Burnaby, you see the transit station next to the traditional 1960s shopping center. This is what's being built as we speak. Ironically, one of the most interesting things with this development is all of the new development was actually built within the parking lot of the 1960s suburb shopping mall. It didn't even have to touch the shopping mall. There was so much wasted land in just the parking area, and all the new parking is down underneath. And in between these stations, along the corridors of light rail, this is the kind of urbanism that we're doing, mid-rise, 6 to 8 story mid-rise urbanism along corridors to transform the city from a linear corridor perspective. This is the Cambie corridor that I oversaw the planning for. So at all sorts of different contexts, from city to suburb, different elements and approaches to densification, what I call the magic of density done well. This is a slide I've been using for 10 years. I started to use it when I was chief planner of Vancouver. As the chief planner, going out to the public to talk about why density is necessary. And the narrative in Vancouver is similar to the narrative I suspect in your city, which is if that anyone's talking about density, it must be developers wanting to talk about density because they want to make more profit. That's the only reason you would talk about density, right? So it was necessary for me, a public official, to go out and talk about all the public interest reasons why cities need to densify in terms of many of the challenges that I already discussed with you. And we always set that context for why we're having a conversation about density. All the things that are possible if you do density well. Reduced energy use in buildings, making active transport work, more green design options that are only possible, like district energy, geothermal, etc., at minimal densities. Certainly less pressure on suburban expansion and sprawl, more affordable housing choices. Even issues like public health and vitality and safety. We have the stats to show you're safer in urban and densified settings rather than lower density settings. So all sorts, we made the case with both the data and the storytelling for why densification is a compelling public interest agenda, an issue, not a private sector profit issue. We had a whole conversation for 2 years called eco-density, which I can provide you more information later if you're interested. But it shows that we've been willing to have the tough conversations about the so-called D word, the third rail of municipal politics, density, which often is a word that city planners will literally almost literally, figuratively tie their tongues in knots trying to avoid saying out loud the density word. We put it right on the front pages of the newspapers. And we defined it. What is density done well? It's a reconsideration of how we do land use and mobility, aligning them in a way that gets past this silo thinking that we see in so many city halls and in so many city development processes. Our planners and our engineers say the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. In other words, if you get your density, your land use, your use mixes right, it does most of the work for you in terms of facilitating transit, walking, and biking. It uses what I call the power of nearness, certainly something you understand in the densification here in the inner city with new rental housing projects that I saw today. The idea that if everything is close by, you don't need to have the debate about whether or not you need a regional transit system to get somewhere or car infrastructure because you can walk as a first case. We know that building additional roads, particularly as you grow at a regional level, won't work, or widening existing roads. I hope an audience like this understands the issue of the nature of the law of congestion and the idea of induced demand, that if you just build more roads, they just fill up. We've known that since 1955. You hopefully all know this quote by now. Adding highway lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. That was said, and no one said it better, in my opinion, way back in 1955. And yet we've been spending the vast majority of our public money to keep building things that we know won't work, that will not solve congestion, instead of funding properly things like regional transit. And it's ironic that you have to have things like a half-cent sales tax, new power, to get regional transit, and that you have no problem funding roads. You ever notice that? There's always room in the budget for roads, but you have to add new taxes to fund regional transit. That's backwards thinking. In Vancouver in the 1990s, we reprioritized, or specifically prioritized, all of our thinking. This is one of the most powerful policies in Vancouver from an urban design perspective, let alone a transportation perspective. Walking first. Think about how that principle will radiate through everything you do. Then biking, second. Then public transit, third. Goods movement, fourth. The car, the private automobile, fifth. We don't ban the car in Vancouver. We just prioritize it last. And this carries through in our public realm design, our space allocation, most importantly in our budgeting. And this is, I've now worked with several cities on establishing this kind of approach. This is in Medellin, Latin America. A main point to make when the politicians start to yell and wave their fists about the so-called war on the car when this conversation happens is, what I say is, if you design a city for cars, what we know definitively, unquestionably, is that it fails for everyone, including drivers. Because everyone is trying to, if you're growing and everyone's trying to drive, nobody's moving well, period. It just takes too much space. If you design a multimodal city that is delightful for walking, biking, and transit, it works better for everyone, including drivers. Notice the key similarity there. Either way, it works better for drivers or worse for drivers. So in other words, this is not a war on the car. This is about making things better for everyone. It's a political narrative. When your politicians are talking about the war on the car, that's politics. It's an easy prioritization to say, though. What I say is that the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision, it's found in its budget. And what I'm increasingly doing with cities is working with them to align their vision and their follow-through. Not only their standards and their rules, but their budget decisions. And as you can imagine, the further away you get from the vision, the more of a breakdown you usually get. And the most common problem with building better cities I've found in cities around the world is a vast chasm between vision and your detailed decisions, particularly the budget. When you're building, how am I doing for time? Okay. When you're building a city for pedestrians first, it's about your vertical infrastructure, not just your horizontal infrastructure. It's designing the city at eye level. That is delightful at the speed of a pedestrian and at the height of a pedestrian. The artful mix of things at eye level, the city at eye level at the speed of a pedestrian. New York City has done some of the best work I've seen in breaking down the elements of the walkable experience into all the aspects of the urban room. So take a look at their work. This is my clients in Brisbane, Australia. This is a convention center, usually the worst blank wall, black box architecture you can have in your downtown. This is people looking into the kitchen watching food being prepared. There is no reason why you need blank walls in any kind of building. The most important urban design policy or principle we have in Vancouver is simple: no blank walls. You've done reasonably well in that, I've seen walking around. I usually have a series of great pictures to shame and embarrass a local audience, but I didn't see an awful lot of those today. But I will say this one was an interesting one for me, because that architecture is usually the kind of architecture that would make me cringe, because it's not necessarily something that creates an interesting pedestrian experience. And yet, that glass was transparent, and you could see in. So as long as there's something interesting going on, a little bit of street theater, it's not that bad. I might add this to my PowerPoint as an interesting, I was unsure how I felt about this building, but I have to say I actually applaud it. Because it's visually permeable at eye level. It doesn't do a lot of other things well, but it's visually permeable at eye level. The concept we work on is the idea that streets are not sewers for traffic. Streets are places that actually you want to stay in and linger. They're not just places to move either people or cars. I call it sticky streets because the idea is that the streets are designed in a way that make you slow down and linger and stop. and do everything to want to stay in a place. And by the way, when I'm talking about walkability, because it's so close to Halloween, I had to put this into the idea that if you're thinking about the walkability of your streets, would they pass the trick-or-treat test? Something that I always like to bring up around Halloween. When you're talking about the urban biking, there's a lot of, I've been interested in the kind of attention you've been getting here in Madison. I haven't seen a lot of separated infrastructure, but in the places where I work, in Vancouver, we're the first North American city to get into double digits for bike mode share, over 10% of all trips by bikes. You're doing well by American standards, which I think you're somewhere around 3 or 4% of trips. Somebody yell out if that's wrong. 6, that's pretty good. And that's interesting because you don't have a lot of separated on-road, on-street biking infrastructure I've seen yet. So you help make my point that if you want to get into double digits, which you're not there yet, you even in a smaller city and a university town that are two big assets for you, you really need to go further in the idea of safe separated bike infrastructure. And that's how you get into the kind of culture of urban biking that becomes more than just mobility, but an awful lot of things like placemaking, where you end up with problems like this of great amount of bike parking. This is a shot I took of your city just to prove that you do have a bit of a bike parking problem, which is certainly around the university at least, which is a great problem to have. But look at that separated bike lane you have. I noted that it's a one-way bike lane, far too wide, and you could actually park a car in it. Which leads to some problems in my observation in other places. So I'm interested, I would have loved to learn more about your infrastructure, but my general sense is that you could go a lot further. In the transit side, we've talked about the kind of need to invest in regional transit system. And then when it comes to cars, do you have car share here? We've got the highest usership of car share of any city in North America in Vancouver, and for that reason, our studies have shown that every car share space replaces 20 vehicles moving around in the city. The average in North America for successful car share is about 12 vehicles, which might be where you are, I'm not sure. But the point is that the more successful your car share is, it can be the game changer in terms of moving from low car use to actual low car ownership. And that saves a lot of space and everything from parking to road space, etc. We had the benefit of hosting the 2010 Winter Olympics, and I was the chief planner at the time. And I called it the largest traffic trial, largest traffic pilot in North American history, because we had to drop car use by 30% in the city that already had the lowest car use per capita in North America. And we were successful, and on the same time we wanted to close down additional streets for civic celebration. This was the kind of civic celebration we saw. Not all 17 days. This was the final day when we beat the United States in hockey for the gold medal in overtime. Or as we call it, the best moment in human history. We needed it more than you did. We care about hockey more than you do, so we needed it more than you did. But the point is, all of those streets that we transformed for those civic celebrations, we've kept closed. And we've embraced the idea that these are places for people. And now, first in terms of the summers, now permanently in the case of many of these in the context of permanent transformation. All this to make the point that it's about space. We know that mobility in urban places isn't necessarily about what comes out of the tailpipe, it's about space. The idea that walking, biking, and transit takes up much less space. My clients in Sydney, Australia make the point this way. How do we move 1,000 people into the downtown? One train, 15 buses, or up to 1,000 cars, taking 1.37 hectares of parking in the central business district. It's about space. A great metric, a great infograph that I would really have liked to have seen on the front page of the Sydney newspapers. There's all sorts of ways to make the point that you can use less space the more people you get shifting to walking, biking, and transit. And it will fundamentally take a reprioritization of space, just like it will fundamentally take a reprioritization of budget. I'm going to skip, you see how much I've been ad-libbing here, I'm going to skip some of these. When we're transforming, or when we're designing the public realm for the public, it's very important to think about how you do height in a way that still creates a human scale. We are known as a tall building city in Vancouver, but our podiums, our mid-rises, are human scale. And I've noted that, at least in the State Street examples, you're doing some very interesting things in terms of establishing that street edge human scale and then stepping back for greater density. Gives you the benefit of body heat, more people, to strengthen the street, but at the street edge create a human scale. We do that through our podium and point tower typology, the idea that we have separated towers, stepped back, that provide privacy and sun access and views, public views to the mountains through the towers, and then the human scale at the street level gets established by the podium. So we do height, but we do it in a different way. And I noticed this compared to your approach to height because of your state level height guidelines, which tends to squash the buildings in a way that's very strong perimeter block. It's a hard conversation to have because you have such a strong and long-standing law about height. You have more towers on the graphic of your event tonight than you actually have in the city of Madison, I noticed. But when we're talking about height in other contexts, what I usually say is height needs to be a design challenge about how to do buildings of every scale better, rather than a dogmatic debate about tall buildings being evil and short buildings being inherently good. I've seen tall buildings designed extremely well. I've seen short buildings designed incredibly poorly. The key variable is design quality, not height. And then the third aspect of density done well is about the amenities. How much of the actual green space and amenity, not just green space, but things like daycare for families, heritage preservation and retention, incorporation into developments, community and cultural facilities, etc. In Vancouver, we actually leverage development through density bonusing and negotiations where more density is given in return for developers to pay for the amenities that the city would never be able to afford on its own. And cities all over the world use this tool, including in North America, or in America, in places like San Francisco, Seattle, New York, etc. I understand you don't do much of it here, and that's a shame because it's a truly powerful tool. When you're talking about density at every possible scale, we're talking about getting better design no matter what the height, no matter what the type of building form, density in a better design outcome. This is our Athletes Village for the 2010 Winter Games. The quality of the public realm, the quality of the architecture, constantly attention to how the building lands at eye level, with amenities and, infrastructure like district energy, which make, in this case, the greenest community in North America, according to the U.S. Green Building Council. At all sorts of densification, all sorts of building types, as you radiate out from your downtown across a regional scale, and doing them all better. When we were doing eco-density, I used terms like gentle, hidden, and invisible density. Row houses and townhouses, I called gentle density. Hidden density was laneway houses in behind off the lane. And secondary suites within the primary home I called invisible density. The idea that you could densify your suburbs, your existing neighborhoods in ways that don't substantially change the physical scale and character. And it's important to have this kind of language. My friend in San Francisco has since coined the term the missing middle. The scales of ground-oriented densification that are between mid-rise and the single detached house. Having these in your parlance and in your codes, radiating out from the downtown, important way to reestablish body heat of pedestrians being able to walk to your downtown and make your communities more complete and sustainable. And even an example like laneway housing, for example, when we were bringing this in Vancouver, I was told by many people, such a small idea, Brent, why are you spending so much time on it? We have over 3,000 laneway houses approved in Vancouver now, by far the most of any city in North America, what we called hidden density, and it's been transformative. But you think that if you think that density as a conversation is easy in Vancouver, it never is. I guarantee our conversations are just as hard as yours. We actually have the youngest son of Jane Jacobs living in Vancouver, and you haven't had a conversation about NIMBY and change until you've had it with Jane Jacobs' son, where you've tried to debate about what Jane meant in the death and life of great American cities. In Vancouver, this was a poster that was done by a community group when we proposed to change the height from just 4 stories to 5, 1 additional floor, which shows you the graphic skills of our community activists, but also the amount of pushback you're going to get in every city. What I say is the conversation needs to shift from not in my backyard, not to yes in my backyard. You've heard about the YIMBY movement. I'm not a big fan of that either. It's not yes or no, it's QUIMBY. It's quality in my backyard. We need a conversation about doing our city making in a more quality way. And I'm just going to end. I know you're about to hook me. But the last thing I want to say is, while we're doing all this permanent city making, there's a lot of really simple ideas that could strengthen our cities, but it's remarkable how hard we make simple ideas. So my clients in Auckland, New Zealand, had a waterfront parking lot. They created a promenade with paint and planters literally overnight. And they've done more to transform their temporary waterfront as they await the redevelopment of their permanent waterfront than any city I've seen in America, or in the world, certainly more than any in North America. The food trucks and the food carts, I'm glad to see that you have some here, at least on State Street near the university. My observation is that you're still sort of timid on that, though, and could probably do an awful lot more. Food trucks are an incredible placemaker. They fill gaps. They're not just food. You can't think of them in terms of an issue of a debate between your restaurants, and so they're a placemaker. They're a gap filler. Similarly, pop-up patio space, so-called streeteries, parklets, all these kinds of things which can activate and make a street more vibrant. I didn't see a lot of scenarios and examples of this in my walk today. Container urbanism, Christchurch, New Zealand, in response to the earthquake, filling those kinds of gaps through temporary container space, which is frankly better urbanism than a lot of the permanent city making I see in parts of the world. But in here you've got Helsinki, you've got Oslo, you've got New York City at South Street Seaport. This is a blank corner in Brisbane, Australia, that was one of the worst corners in the downtown and is now one of the best through a simple insertion of a container. And this is a parking space in Gothenburg, Sweden that I just got back from, a double-stacked temporary night spot in containers at the edge of a parking space that was pretty much of a dead space. So there's a lot of things we can do in the meantime if we just open up to new ideas, get out of our own way, and have a culture of smarter city making. Thank you very much.